Alright students, welcome back to Medieval 1450. Today we're talking about the Black Death. It's a nasty illness, and while I won't be showing you pictures of modern cases of the bubonic plague, we will be seeing some medieval images of the disease. Just a little forewarning. Now, your only experience with the Black Death might be Monty Python's ever funny Bring Out Your Dead sketch. Well, we'll go a little bit beyond that sort of comical imagery. So we are now heading properly into what's defined as the late Middle Ages. This period is characterized by a series of climatic changes, most notably the Little Ice Age. In about 1250 or 1250, the medieval warm period comes to an end. Europe, which has enjoyed warmer temperatures in particular, gets significantly cooler. The climatic changes bring about disaster for many people. Increased storms contribute to the formation of what's known as the Zuiderzee, the inland sea in the Netherlands, as the storm water surges over the grazing, weakened coastal dunes and fills the subsiding drain land. The cooler temperatures also change up where agriculture can be practiced. England, which had developed some limited wine production, loses its ability to do so. Greenland settlement is abandoned. Our best guess is that as agriculture becomes more difficult, people slowly moved out for better opportunities until the community finally was no more. Increased storminess causes several instances of famines. In particular, the years 1315 to 1317 see famine in much of northern Europe. When people run out of food, they get desperate. Several revolts rock Europe, perhaps most notably that of William Wallace. Yes, the one from Braveheart. Populations already stressed by famine are more susceptible to disease outbreaks. But nobody could have guessed in 1340 what was actually coming, something so far outside this normal typical context. And if we look at this graph, we can see the temperature changes. They don't look large, but the change of much less than 1 degree can cut off those crucial days of the growing season, or make winters that much more likely to kill off perennial crops like grapevines. Of course, we're not exactly in any danger of going back down to the Little Ice Age temperature, but what happens when we go that much above the medieval warm period? I'm sure it's fine. It'll be fine, I'm sure. So, based on analysis of those who died from the Black Plague, and we have several mass burials, some of which have enough remnant DNA to recover markers of illness, Yersinia pestis is likely the disease that caused the Black Plague. Yersinia pestis manifests in several forms. Bubonic plague is the form largely described during the outbreak. Its primary feature is the swelling of lymph nodes into large, tender growths that often turn black. Called buboes, this is where the term comes from. Sometimes from the get-go, or otherwise as a progression of the disease, the plague manifests itself as a septicemic plague, that is, where tissue, particularly on extremity, dies, or a pneumonic plague, wherein the disease main symptoms are in the lungs. Yersinia pestis seems to be endemic to rat populations, but there causes few enough deaths that it remains within the population. But rats often carry fleas, and they can act as carriers, holding the disease until they land on other animals, including humans. So we have rat fleas and people. Rats travel on boats or over land, humans carry the disease, fleas in cloth, or hiding on other animals temporarily. We're not fully sure which method is the primary way they spread, but it's probably a mix. But all these transmissions made it easy for the plague to spread across trade routes, especially by sea. The plague originated in West Asia, probably in China, which was a populous region even then. The plague spreads rapidly along major trade routes. The Silk Road, a very old set of trading routes that brought silk and other trade goods overland from China and East Asia, was one such pathway. The Mongol Empire, spreading from what is today still referred to as Mongolia, expanded rapidly over the 13th century, and while cracks in their empire are already showing at this time, at its height it created a continuous route of Mongol-owned land from the borders of Poland to the Pacific Ocean, including all of China. They support the Silk Road and its branching routes, making the spread of humans, goods, pests, and the disease all easier. Sea trade, which we've already discussed in our Travel and Trade Day, also makes this possible. The plague finally arrives in Europe through Kaffa. This is a Genoese trading port in the Black Sea. Kaffa is besieged in 1346 by Mongols. Besieged cities and siege camps are both breeding grounds for illness due to their poor conditions, and the plague, already moving west, flourishes there. There is also a story of the dead being launched by catapult over the walls, but this is probably apocryphal, or that is to say, not true. But the disease makes it inside nonetheless. From there, the Black Death spreads rapidly, following the sea trade routes through Constantinople, Greece, and into the Italian city-states. And here is the pattern of its spread in Europe. By the end of 1347, it had reached Italy. By 1348, France, modern-day Austria, and the south of England had been affected. By 1349, most of Western Europe was infected, and much of Scandinavia untouched until 1350. One of the most evocative descriptions of the plague is found in the Decameron. The Decameron was written by Giovanni Boccaccio, who lived from 1313 to 1375. It was completed by 1353, a remarkable feat given that it depends on the plague's arrival to drive the story. This is a frame narrative, like the Canterbury Tales. Chaucer probably took inspiration from reading it. The idea is that 10 people, specifically 7 women and 3 men, have fled Florence due to the plague. For the next 10 days, each tells a story, so 100 in total. The introduction, which sets the stage for why they all leave Florence, is therefore a focused description of the plague and its societal effects. This gives us a powerful way to see how the plague was seen and how people responded to it. So what are some of these responses? So there's lots of different approaches, right? The people panic. The people specifically who panic, those who almost descend into hedonism in an effort to forget what is occurring, and those who turn to God. Think some about how you might respond. But what might be the most telling is how the sick and the dead are treated. What happens to them? Many of the sick are left untreated and the dead unburied. This is the ultimate sign of a societal breakdown when people aren't caring for each other, and we often judge societies by the respect they give to the dead. What are the other social consequences? There is, in fact, open conflict in the streets, and most importantly, it seems like the major authorities have all but disappeared or, if present, their authority simply is not recognized. In such an environment, is anyone safe? No, of course not. The disease strikes seemingly without warning at all levels of society. Nobody is safe, and there are even more dangers beyond the plague. So there are a lot of ways to respond to the plague. You can ignore the issue, pretend that the plague isn't a threat, or accept your death as a real responsibility. Drink, be merry, and try not to think about the Grim Reaper standing right behind you. We can try to understand what's going on. Some treat the sick, and those who are treating the sick, many of them die. Miasma is a common explanation. The idea that exposure to bad air causes the diseased people to go around with posies, bunches of flowers, and other sweet-smelling things to try to keep the disease from spreading to them. It's also one of the reasons people flee to the country in particular. It's a good step, although the underlying rationale is bogus. Diseases can be airborne, but often there are other transmissions, and it's not the air itself. The germ theory of disease is still some centuries off. Of course, there's always those willing to offer miracle cures, and they are as effective as snake oil salesmen are today. That is, they aren't affected at all, or rather effective at all, but the theories from formal physicians cannot be much better in this time period. You can hide, that is, flee from the plague to the countryside, or, in the case of nobles and clergy, to forts. Potentially safer, but the disease can still follow you, sometimes food can run out, and how do you respond to a lord who abandons his people? And one can pray and hope that God responds. Some people may happen to survive, reaffirming their faith. But what happens if he doesn't? When the faithful die in just as great a number as the unfaithful, the good as the bad? We can try to find who is responsible. A common response is that someone is to blame. This is generally taken from the principle that the disease must be a punishment for sins. But who can be blamed? Well, Jews, Muslims, where available, physicians, women, especially midwives, and indeed anyone you might have a grudge against becomes targets. So let's take a look at one account of a pogrom, that is a mob led against the Jewish community in the city of Strasbourg in 1349. For starters, what is the crime the Jewish population of Strasbourg is accused of? They are accused of poisoning the wells, and this is clearly a popular assumption. Now, we know this isn't the real transmission of the plague, but diseases do often spread through water sources. At its base, though, is the fear that Jews were truly hostile to their community, and there's really no logic in this, just the fear at something they can't understand. So the Jewish population is rounded up to be burned. Who is spared? So some Jews are baptized and some of their children are baptized. By converting, they are no longer distant from the Christian community and can be spared. But right at the end of this, there are some very introspective and revealing comments. Why are the Jews really killed? The account asserts that, in the end, the money was indeed the thing that killed the Jews. The debts owed to them by lords, to whom they clearly had been lending, again going back to the professions they often had as primarily moneylenders, are part of what ended up dooming this particular community. So, when we talk about people being accused, think less of this as actual evidence than people's fears and grievances brought to the fore under such stresses. Let's also discuss one of the major responses to the plague. The flagellants were a religious movement, particularly popular in Germany. This image here depicts a group of them in the Netherlands. They may have been centered in Germany, but spread all across Europe. Flagellants would move from town to town in processions, whipping themselves and begging forgiveness from God. A rather frightening display of faith. Even the church was rather put off by them and tried to discourage the practice. But while the plague raged on, even the most desperate measures seemed reasonable. Sadly, moving from town to town in large numbers was a good way to actually spread the disease. Flagellants injured themselves, weakening their own defenses against the plague, not to mention spreading blood from their self-inflicted wounds. They could travel from town to town, taking the Black Death with them, even as they sought to ward it off. In the aftermath of the disease, we see several major changes in Europe. Already on the rise, images of skeletons and death rise in number in the wake of such high casualties. Although associations with time and with a sickle or scythe predate this period, the growth of a consistent image of death begins. Here you can see, among others, a woodcut depicting a skeletal figure mowing down people with a scythe. The indiscriminate, sweeping cuts of a scythe are a perfect representation for how the plague struck, fast and merciless. These images exist in part to remind people that they are mortal and that the pleasures of sin, especially wealth, are all too ephemeral. In addition to general images of death, the biggest new image is the danse macabre. This image takes many forms, but tends to include one of the dead or death himself calling the dead to dance. Death is merry and eager, inviting those from all walks of life to join in the dance. Again, like the image of the scythe, death comes suddenly and to all. The dead are often depicted with clothing or jewelry indicating multiple social statuses to further this effect. And oftentimes you also see images of similar skeletons holding the heads or the bodies of various people of different social statuses, such as bishops, kings, as well as your average peasant or knight or anything like that. In the end, 40 to 60% of Europe dies between 1347 and 1353. Some communities are nearly untouched, but others are all but wiped out from existence, and the disease has something like a 90% death rate. So when a whole community is infected, it can be reduced to basically a ghost town. Such communities are abandoned or limp along, taking decades or even centuries to recover. Half the workforce of Europe is just simply gone. Lords have a difficult time finding the workforce to recover, as there are simply not enough peasants to farm their land. However, Europe's population had also been running up against limited good land and resources. Suddenly, this problem is gone. Limited labor means higher wages, and even those of lower status can start affording more luxuries. But although some of these results were good, the event itself was incredibly traumatizing. What faith should peasants have in the old social order when their lord failed to protect them from the plague, or died from a disease people feared was a punishment when they did not? What role does God play in a world where this could happen? In many ways, Europe had already been changing, and this was just another catalyst for change. Before we wrap up, a couple final points. The plague doesn't just disappear. Although it burns itself, outbreaks recur for centuries thereafter. Here you can see a plague doctor's mask, now held in the German Historical Museum in Berlin. Emergent in the 17th century, the iconic mask contained aromatic materials in the hopes of repelling the miasma, that is, the bad air. Bubonic plague is not the only disease with the potential to have devastating impact. The 1918 Spanish flu killed some 3 to 5% of the world's population. Some methods used to combat the plague were, in fact, effective. Although plague masks were built off faulty understanding, separation from the infected and the dead does help prevent infection. The practice of quarantine, the term for a 40-day wait for ships in Italian ports to ensure they weren't effective, is still at its base how we try to ensure those who are infected or are potentially infected won't spread the illness. While our understanding of disease has given us a larger and more effective toolbox to handle disease, a sudden outbreak like the Spanish flu still might strike rapidly, spreading orders of magnitude faster with modern transportation, and the social and economic consequences of a major outbreak are still too real. And in fact, this lecture is no more pertinent pretty much than any time than now in the wake, and in fact the continuation of the coronavirus scare. So hopefully this is a reminder of being smart in taking necessary precautions to prevent yourself from getting infected and prevent yourself from spreading the infection.